We've passed the 100 number mark. Can you all see that, Becky and Corey? Great, that's fabulous.
Our program will now begin.
Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to our series on conversations about racial injustice, a movement towards fairness and equity. Today's conversation is about how racism permeates American institutions. For purposes of today's discussion, I will use Solid Ground's definition of institutional racism as a systematic distribution of resources, power, and opportunity in our society to benefit people who are white and to the exclusion of people of color. History has taught us that present-day racism was built on a long history of racially distributed resources and ideas that have shaped Americans' views of themselves and others. It is a hierarchical system that comes with a broad range of policies and institutions to preserve the status quo. In the United States, institutional racism has been responsible for the enslavement of people of African descent, the dispossession of indigenous people of this country, resulting in their settlement on reservations, segregation, and internment camps where Japanese Americans were incarcerated. While most of these institutions no longer exist, they have had long-term impacts on American society. As a result of institutional racism, racial stratification and disparities have occurred and persisted in employment, housing, education, healthcare, and we talked about that last week, government, and in other sectors. While many laws were passed during the 1960s to make discrimination illegal, major inequities and inequalities exist, and we observe the persistence of institutional racism and its manifestation in many ways. Many of us have been subjected to racial profiling by security and law enforcement workers. We have witnessed the use of stereotyped racial caricatures by institutions, such as the use of Native American mascots in sports. We've seen that in the Washington, D.C.'s professional football team, which I will not name because I presume you know who the team is of which I speak. We've also seen the use of very negative symbols against Native Americans in Cleveland's baseball team. Again, I will not use their name because you know which team I'm speaking about. We've also witnessed the under and misrepresentation of certain racial groups in the media. We've also witnessed barriers to employment as well as professional advancement based on race. Let me now share with you some stark data that depict the results of institutional racism. For example, people of color are more likely to live in poverty than whites, with 29.1% of African Americans, for example, and 19.2% of Latinos living below the poverty level, compared to only 7.6% of white households. That is a substantial distinction. Moreover, the median income of white households is almost twice that of African American households. Let's take food insecurity for a moment. Of adults who have reported that food money for their families often does not last, 29.2% are Latino, 12% are African Americans, in sharp contrast to 5.3% for white citizens. Health and environmental justice are other areas where disparities exist. African Americans are almost 2/3 less likely than white Americans to have health insurance, and a whopping 79% of hazardous waste sites are located in communities where the majority of residents are people of color. Colleagues, this represents the lived experience of significant numbers of Black and brown citizens of our nation. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Corey Fields and Dr. Becky Hsu, both of whom are distinguished scholars in our sociology department. Let me say a few words about Dr. Hsu's background. She's an associate professor and has an affiliation with the Asian Studies Program, the Initiative for US-China Dialogue on Global Issues, and the Graduate School's most recently developed program in health and public interest. Dr. Hsu is directing a research group on the topic of culture and the common good, a project of the Initiative for US-China Dialogue in the Office of Global Engagement. Her latest book, The Chinese Pursuit of Happiness, Anxieties, Hopes, and Moral Tensions in Everyday Life, was just published last September. What defines happiness and how can we get it? The ways in which people in China ask this universal question tells us quite a lot about the tensions and challenges they face during periods of remarkable social and economic change. Dr. Hsu is currently on the editorial board of the Journal of Scientific Study of Religion, and she has several research interests, which include sociology of religion, organizations and institutions, and global and transnational sociology. You'll hear a lot from her about racism in organizations and institutions. Let me speak a little bit about Dr. Corey Fields. Dr. Corey Fields is also an associate professor and the Idol Family Chair, a chaired position in the sociology department. His research explores the role of identity at both the individual and collective level in structuring social life. Dr. Fields is the author of Black Elephants in the Room, The Unexpected Politics of African American Republicans. Very timely topic in light of our presidential election and the elections of many of the individuals who are currently serving in Congress and the Senate. His book explores a dynamic relationship between race and political institutions in contemporary United States politics and has been covered in many, many media outlets. His current research draws on the experiences of African American professionals in the advertising industry to examine the relationship between racial identity and professional identity within private sector organizations. Without any further ado, let me turn the program over to Dr. Fields.
Thanks, Rosemary, for that awesome introduction. And thanks, Becky, for joining me in this conversation today. I've been looking forward to this ever since Rosemary asked us to do it. One of the reasons I was really eager to do this is partly the focus on institutions and organizations, right? Like when we've been talking about a lot of the recent conversations over the past few months about race and racism, right? And racial justice, right? They're all kind of linked together. But a lot of them has focused on sort of either micro level things where it's like individuals, like, is this a racist person, or did this person, you know, discriminate against me because of my race, right? Sort of very much almost an interactional level of racism. Or they've been sort of big macro conversations of like structural inequality, where there's sort of a vague sense of agency of like society is doing stuff, or they're like sort of vague, things operating to produce unequal outcomes, like many of the outcomes Rosemary was just talking about. But what I'm excited about with this conversation is it's actually that sort of middle ground of like this meso level, right? Not micro, not macro, but in between. And it's sort of focused on organizations, like actual companies, places, organizations, nonprofits, like actual units, like acting units who, but the cool thing about, this level of analysis is it's not at all disconnected from the micro or the macro, right? Because the organizations we operate in are populated by individuals and they function within broader systems, right? So I want to think one of the things that I think the conversation today will be good is to think through, what's happening within organizations, right? And part of that is like what's happening within organizations that is, either helping produce racial justice or actually reproduce racial inequality, right? So we can think of organizations as agents of racial outcomes, right? Like they are sort of partly causes. But we can also think of organizations as sort of distinct units that have their own internal racial dynamics. And I imagine, a lot of this conversation will focus on that, right? Like what's happening within the organizations we work at, or what's happening within the organizations that, we shop at, or, we worship at, right? Like these are churches, stores, right? These are all sort of units that have their own internal racial dynamics. And so, in my own work, that's, sort of exploring that relationship between particular organizations and how individual, either Black Republicans or individual employees end up managing or experiencing their own racial identity is a big sort of part of the work I've been doing and what I think about in my own research. Because, in some ways, right, we think about, sort of organizations as being, sort of determined by sort of racial outcomes, right? Like people come to them with racial identities and those racial identities inform the way they act within organizations. But one of the things I'm very interested in is the way organizations can structure how people understand their own racial identities, right? Like sort of the way we think about race, the way we talk about race, the way we experience race doesn't exist a priori of the organizations we're involved in, actually, right? It might be that our involvement in those organizations structure how we think about race, right? Like in my work on Black Republicans, that was a big point, right? The way that Black Republicans sort of think about race and understand their own racial identity and express their own racial identity is absolutely conditioned on the Republican Party, the state Republican Party that they're involved in, or even the national level Republican Party. So the ways that organizations set the territory or set the parameters around race have massive implications for individual lives, people's lives. So I'm excited. I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. I come into this studying institutions, focusing on basically the patterns in what people do and how those become crystallized into norms, whether the norms are formal or informal. And I think those are really important in thinking about what happens with race and how people get treated, how people treat each other, and what are the outcomes of that. So yes, I'm also excited about this meso level, sort of organizational, institutional level of analysis.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that I was thinking about with this conversation was, it's worth thinking about, because a lot of the talk has been, there's been a lot of talk recently about, professional organizations and their responses to racial injustice, right? So, we've gotten a lot of statements from companies. And one of the things that I thought has been interesting is like, as a lot of companies are making these big statements, a lot of their employees are then coming out saying like, wait, who is this? Like, like you have this great statement about racial inequality and producing racial justice, but my day-to-day work experiences don't sort of replicate these values that you're talking about. And I think, this is something, thinking about the work I've done on politics was really the case with Black Republicans, right? Like the sort of experience of being a Black Republican was fundamentally conditioned on, what is it that white Republicans wanted to hear? And so one aspect of this is, thinking through what an organization is going to do in terms of like working to produce racial justice, right? Or working to be anti-racist or inclusive or diverse, right? These public statements. I think it's also critical for organizations to think through not just what you're saying outward facing, but how is what you're saying outward facing aligned with what's happening internally within your organization. And so, and it's like, a lot of times it's like we can think about these sort of statements as almost ideal types of what people want to be, what organizations want to achieve. But a lot of times there's sort of a gap between that and what they're actually doing internally. So, I have to say, like a lot of, what I thought with seeing a lot of these statements and then hearing employees at these companies react to those statements was, it seems like a lot of places need to get their own house in order before they can start, these sort of, public conversations around some of this. I don't know.
Yeah, actually, I think this question of how do institutions produce justice? First, get your house in order, but how do we do that, or how do people do that? And I think one of the things I think that's important to realize, or for people to grapple with, is that organization. It's rare that it's just sort of a bad apple, like that just causes everything. People are in these webs of formal and informal rules, and so they can only do things if the environment sort of allows them to, or even promotes a certain thing. So like for, I think of this in terms of informal versus formal, and the informal rules can span sort of all these different things. It could be like, whether people respond to a group email in a workspace or workplace that has racist content in it. Do people respond or not? Is that normal or not? It might be what is okay to say in the hallways to colleagues. And these are interactional, but then there's norms and there's sort of things that are acceptable and not acceptable. And actually, as Rosemary was talking about, the income disparities, Ann Rawls and Waverly Duck have a new book out, Tacit Racism, and they have a chapter in it that I love. It's on high status, the experiences of high status Black men in corporate environments. And they describe how, it seems just interactional. One person was interviewed, said, well, my assistant who's assigned to help me, when I tell her to do stuff, she goes above me and asks my boss if she should do it. And so how is he able to do work? How could he get, how can he rise up even more in the organization if these sort of informal things that are going on, these are not, encoded in rules, but they're happening and sort of acceptable in some way. If these things are going on, it's going to be sort of this persistence.
That raises an interesting point for me, because it sort of points to thinking about, are looking to be more inclusive and more diverse and folding new types of people or different people into them. A lot of times I think something that gets left out or not as deeply considered is, how do our old rules handle new people, right? If that makes any sense, right? It's like sort of, are our systems and norms and rules and structures and bureaucracies and hierarchies equipped to deal with people who are different, right? Who maybe come with different value systems or different experiences or different perceptions among the people already here, right? And so, this was something that came up a lot in my research on Black Republicans, right? Where they would sort of talk about the internal structure of the party that was sort of organized in the seniority based, right? So the people who got to achieve high positions within the state party were the people who had been involved in organizing for the longest amount of time, right? And so you can probably anticipate where this is going, right? As say a state party tries to get more Black people involved, right? They're relatively new. So they end up at the bottom of the hierarchy within the organization. And people at the bottom of the hierarchy or within the organization have less of a say in terms of how things get done. So the parties would often have this, state parties would often have this experience where the Black people felt like, you know, I'm here, but nobody listens to me. Like, I don't have any voice. I can't make anything happen. And so, you know, I think one of the things, I mean, and what you're pointing to with Waverly Duck and Ann Rawls' research is sort of saying, it's like, it's not enough to just have the people there, right? You also have to have systems in place that, you know, embolden the people there, right? And sometimes it might be that, you know, what you've been doing worked fine, right? Like, it's like, it was fine when there was less difference. But now that, you know, the population of, say, workers or members or parishioners, right, is different, your old systems in place might actually, I mean, certainly will have like the appearance of like, well, why is it that all the people, you know, at the bottom of this are the most diverse people? And it's like, that seems weird and might be off-putting. But it might not just be cosmetic, right? It might not just be decorative. It actually might be that, right, you have structures in place that are preventing you from hearing. I mean, someone just asked, you know, how can we encourage people on all sides to think about racial justice as an issue above and beyond, say, partisanship or particular politics? And an interesting way to think about that is sort of my work on advertising agencies and Black people in advertising. And I don't know, I mean, I'm not sure how I feel about this, but the extent to which, you know, acceptance and inclusion gets coded as a profitable operation, right? And it's like a value add, has real implications for how organizations incorporate the voices of their Black employees, right? So when a company feels like, oh, this is gonna make us money, I mean, and then the Black employees within the company have more of a voice, right? Like, they get to say more about decision-making. They get to say more about how processes operate, right? So I think part of the answer to the question is, like, within any organization, you have to sort of recognize what the sort of, I don't know, motivating values are. And then maybe it's finding a way to link, you know, racial inclusion to those values. So in corporations, the organizing, you know, value is profit. And so to the extent that you can effectively link diversity and inclusion to profit, it's going to garner, you know, more legitimacy, right? Within, so, right, one of the things I found in my study of the Republican Party, right, was Black Republicans often felt like the organizing principle wasn't really centered around anything related to full inclusion. It was much more about sort of representation. And so that was sort of where, you know, power and authority kind of got capped, right? So it was like, the point was that, oh, if you were there, it was to be sort of representative, right? To sort of, to be, you know, part of the picture of like, look, it's demonstrating diversity, but that meant that, you know, the mechanisms for like gaining access to power and decision-making authority were less closed off, because like the point wasn't about sort of shifting how decisions get made. It was more about shifting what, you know, party brochures looked like, right? So, right, so I mean, I guess this is just a really long-winded way of me saying of like, yes, I absolutely agree with you around the sort of the importance of institutional norms and institutional rules, right? Because it's, like you said, it's informal, but I also think the formal stuff is super important too.
Right, yeah. So as you were talking about how like an organizational form deals with new people that are, and then now it's diverse, what happens? I mean, can you just stay the same? one of the things, and actually this may answer one of the questions that came in earlier, which is, can you give us some specific constructs, systems, offices that need to be activated or set up in organizations to begin the process of alignment? So one thing I think we can look at is organizational charts. I mean, and that's exactly kind of what you're talking about, Corey, like organizational charts, but also mapped by race, and see like where are people and who is determining sort of all these other things. One of the things to look at is who answers to whom. So there's a classic sociological study. It's actually of the Challenger explosion, the spaceship, by Diane Vaughan. And it's a classic in organizational studies, but she looks at the way that the incentives are organized by sort of, structure. And actually her explanation for what happened and that ultimately led to the explosion was actually that people were incentivized or motivated to answer to their superiors by saying that, things were all fine. Anyway, one of the things we can look at is the organizational chart and see like who is answering to whom and who needs to answer to whom to keep their job, and to, who's getting direction from whom, and to see that by race. I think that's really important.
Right.
Also, yeah, I mean, even like, a lot of organizations have like, let's say like a diversity office or something like that. Even those, like, it depends who they answer to, and you have to see like, well, what are they hired to do, and what do they, what is their job? And even that has to be looked at, I think.
Right. I mean, yeah. So this is essentially right in terms of like sort of organizational stuff, or the way that sort of organizations are structured in terms of like, where does power exist? Like, where does authority exist? And actually someone asked about sort of thinking through issues around diversity and inclusion groups that like specific units within the company might be putting together, right? So like, some departments, like we're putting together a diversity and inclusion group to figure something out, right? I think one of the things I would say is it's probably worth having a conversation, maybe some internal disagreement and some fighting to get some resolution on about what's the source of power for this group, right? Is this group sort of independently empowered, and can it do stuff like on its own without having to get buy-in from everybody else or other units, right? Because if it can't, then, one, that sort of suggests that this isn't something that people want to sort of fully let loose to sort of do what it wants to do, which maybe it's not ready to. I don't know the specifics of your particular organization, right? But it is sort of telling about what can be done if, this sort of group doesn't have independent power and authority. And as you were saying, this sort of trickles down to like an individual level of employees. So if the head of, the diversity group, right, can't do anything without running it through the department manager, well, it's only going to work if the department manager is on board with everything, right? And this was connected to the question also, was like, how do you get sort of thinking about selecting people to be in these groups? And I mean, that's a hard question, right? Like, it's not really clear. Like, I wouldn't personally say, oh, you should like absolutely condition participation on certain, certainly not demographic characteristics or ideological commitments around things. And so I think, for it to fully work, it's probably going to need the buy-in of the whole group or institution, right? So if you're putting together a department committee on diversity and inclusion, it seems like if you want it to be effective, you're going to need actors involved in it who sort of represent the range of interest within, the unit, right? And partly that's going to mean fighting about, well, what is this group going to do? And because everyone's not going to agree on that. But absent a sort of clear, focused vision, with sort of thinking about action around a clear focused vision of maybe even outcomes that you want, right? And then you can sort of develop action strategies. You probably won't end up with much. But if you construct it in a way that's like, well, we're all going to agree and we're all going to head nod about it and everyone's going to be on board, but then what happens when you try to take this vision to other people within the unit who weren't involved in it? And so now, it becomes tough. And so, I think in some ways this sort of points to a general organizational challenge, right? Like as organizations try to, increase the range of people who populate them, it becomes more difficult to do these sort of coordination tasks. And I don't have like a happy answer on that. I think it's just sort of this thing where it's like, we're gonna have to struggle with it and fight. And sometimes you'll get it wrong and that'll be unpleasant, but hopefully sometimes you get it right. And we forgot to mention earlier that this recording is going to be posted on the IDEA website. So IDEAA.georgetown.edu within the next 48 hours. So someone asked about that too. So so if you find this ridiculously compelling that you want to go back and watch it on, projected to your big screen TV, it'll be up for you in the next 48 hours.
So as you were talking, I was thinking about sort of a second specific construct, I think, that organizations can look at, which is the process of giving raises. This is directly related to racial equality and inequality within an organization, right? Who gets the raises and who gets to rise up, who gets to be promoted. And one of the things that's been interesting lately is the use of algorithms. So algorithms and also artificial intelligence, AI, these things are systematizing certain sort of, actually hiring also, and raises and salaries. And I think these are really important to look at. There are statisticians, and there's one at Yale who's studying fairness in artificial intelligence, because she argues that to counteract the biases that people, put in, or seemingly neutral variables, you actually have to do something about it to create equity. And I think one of the things, like, you could have, let's say like a system or an algorithm based on just seniority or maybe like status. But if you look at the structure of who has higher status or then, and you see that it's certain races that get a higher status, then that says something about who's getting the raises, right? So
right.
Seemingly neutral variables like seniority can actually be a factor in creating more inequality between races, because if they're promoting the people or giving raises to those who are already at higher status, and all those people who are higher status are of a certain race, then what ends up happening, the outcome, even if it's not intended, is that racial inequality increases. That's something, and I think that's something a lot of organizations are doing these days. And the thing is, we have to actively, I think the organizations have to actively be looking at this, because these things seem neutral. So some organizations have a separate fund to address race inequities, and they'll look at like people of the same position, but and see if there's a lot of inequity that's racial. And if there is, then they have a process to fix that. But that doesn't just correct itself automatically.
A couple of people, so people should submit questions, because I feel like we're talking, but also I'm seeing some questions that kind of are relating to what we're talking about. So we'll ebb and flow in and out. And I think your point is sort of this notion of like algorithms, in terms of it's not just enough to have the algorithm in place that's fair, right? You have to sort of understand the context in which that algorithm is being enacted. And if the initial context is like, well, right, okay, we're going to have an algorithm, and the algorithm is going to value seniority in determining like compensation. Well, if your workplace has, for decades excluded certain people, but has recently been super aggressive and super sincere and super earnest about like incorporating them, that's super awesome. But your algorithm is still going to produce this effect of where like the newer people are going to get less. And hey, maybe that's what you want. That's okay. But I think, it's important that, organizations grapple with what they want and talk about that honestly, right? Versus sort of saying like, we have an algorithm and the algorithm told us. And it's like, well, okay, but someone wrote the algorithm, right? I mean, which is the point you're making. I guess, I don't know, this doesn't feel like that twisted of a connection, but a couple of people have asked, one asked about sort of, it sounds like we're talking about cultural change and not just change the people who are there, but how do you actually do that? And then someone asked about suggestions for getting individuals to honestly admit their own bias towards people. And I would love to hear your takes on these too. And so I'm speaking absolutely just as Corey Fields, and not as a professional whose job it is to figure these kind of things out. But I actually would say, I would spend less time trying to make individual people be better. And I would instead have an organization that lays out clear rules and expectations of behavior and what you're supposed to do, and lays out the consequences for violations of those behaviors, right? Because it's like, as someone noted, it's hard to try to convince people to sort of completely change their like cultural perspectives on whole as groups of people, right? But what is kind of easy is not easy, but maybe it's easier to say, we're going to have a set of rules in place that you have to do X, Y, and Z in the workplace, or you can't do X, Y, and Z in the workplace. And I'm not asking you to love Corey or think he's awesome or think he's special, but what I am telling you you can't do is, make jokes about coming up out of the ghetto to him, right? It's like, well, so I would say, I would focus on trying to change practices, not people. And so if you sort of say within the company, what is and isn't allowed, or clearly articulate that. And it's not easy, right? Coming up with it. Like, these are obviously things that you have to fight about, you have to run by legal, and everything should be on the up and up. But I would say, as organizations grapple with these problems, you're probably going to be much better served in terms of thinking through how you want your place to run, as opposed to thinking through like, how can I make everybody in the organization feel the way I do about something? I'm not even sure that's what you want, right? So I don't know, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that question around.
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think people, right. Well, as sociologists, we're not that interested in like changing specific individual people or, how they feel, but kind of seeing what the social context is like and what it promotes and also what it allows. So yes, total agreement.
Let's see. So we've had a couple questions about the power of diverse boards influencing change in organizations. How might an organization address the recalibration of space? Oh, that's a separate question. But this notion of like diverse boards and diversity. I mean, I think, representation is important, but it's not necessarily enough. And so I think, if you can have a diverse set of decision makers who have power and authority, that I think can lead to actual organizational change or institutional change, right? Like, it's not just enough to have those people there. And so you have to think about what's the process through which someone gets on a board or how someone gets elected. So, and one of the things I, talk about in my book on Black Republicans is the kind of Black Republican who gets to be successful is the Black Republican who talks about race in ways that sit comfortably with white gatekeepers, right? So a big part of this is who's making the decision about who gets power. And if, the gatekeepers are saying, well, we only want Black people in here who are gonna talk about race in a way that like pushes us but doesn't challenge us, what you're gonna end up with is Black people who push but don't challenge. And maybe that'll, make a difference, right? But that's what you're going to get. So I guess that's sort of just the bigger point of, it's not just enough to have people around. You have to think about like sort of the recruitment practices, like how are you getting people in, and are your sort of decisions structured in such a way that no one who thinks differently about it or who talks differently about it is gonna succeed. You're probably gonna have problems, right? Certainly if diversity and inclusion is a goal, right? And so part of this, there's been research on people talk about cultural fit, right? And how it operates as this mechanism to actually sort of reproduce inequality and discrimination, because it's like, well, no, we just want people who like to do the same kind of stuff that we do because it makes it easier. And here's the thing, it probably does make it easier to get the report out if you can bullshit about, some stupid hobby that you share with somebody. But when you think about hobbies aren't randomly distributed, right? Their sort of activities are patterned. It might be worth sort of pushing to think, well, what is it that we're looking to do here? And how are, our decision metrics may be sort of reproducing an outcome we don't want, right?
Yeah, that makes me think this sort of people that we like and people that we feel comfortable with or get along with, that actually comes into play in hiring as well. So I'm thinking of all those audit studies where they send out identical resumes, but with different names. There's one that Michael Gaddis published somewhat recently called Discrimination in the Credential Society, an audit study of race and college selectivity in the labor market. But basically, Black candidates from elite universities only do as well as white candidates from less selective universities. And then the race results in a double penalty. When the employers respond to the Black candidates, it's for jobs with lower starting salaries and lower prestige than those of the white peers. But when when people are going through resumes, sometimes they go oh, I went to that camp, or oh, I do this, or whatever. And this is the kind of stuff that actually does come into play when people are, let's say going through a stack of 100 resumes. Well, they pick the ones that they like. And this is something that has to be actively, addressed, rather than oh, it's fine. These things
Right.
actually are rather important.
Mm.
There was this other, so somebody asked a really interesting question. I don't really have an answer to it, but I think it's a great question. So it's the question of how much we should be asking minority members to fix everything. Okay.
Not at all, because we didn't break it.
Right.
No, okay, go. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Minorities have to, right. Minorities have to use all their time. And then people think it's minorities' job to reform organizations that are actually marginalizing them. So
Right.
on top of being marginalized, they also have to go fix stuff. And then of course that means that they have less time to do the work that would help them get promoted, etc. But there's a balance to that. And the question was asking, okay, there's that, but then on the other hand, we don't want sort of white power cliques going into paternalistic sort of mode and saying, okay, here's what we're gonna do for you. So I don't know, Corey, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's funny because I sort of anticipated that a question like this would probably come up. And so I sort of been noodling around what to say about it. In some ways, I guess, one way to think about this is and actually, right, okay, now I get to casually self-promote. So I'm thinking about this a lot in context of my new project on racial identity and professional identity in corporate context. And they're actual professional fields where people are my job is to help organizations fix issues of diversity and inclusion, and drawing on my experience as, a member of X category, I have some expertise to help you think about that, right? I think institutions, if they can't manage that internally on how to do that without, sort of forcing some random accountant just because she's Black to help fix things, then they need to consider getting that expertise from outside the institution, right? And so that might be, I mean, I think my general response to these kind of things is, I don't think it's fair to ask employees to be an accountant, but also a diversity coordinator, but only pay them for their accounting work, right? So it ends up being this like extra, you know, I guess we could think about it as like the hazard pay of being, you know, a Black professional or a trans professional or a woman professional or an Asian professional, right? You have to do the job, but then you also have to do all this extra diversity work, right? And I don't think, so right, so in that sense, I don't think it's actually fair to look to employees to do that kind of work. I mean, I think if an institution feels like managing this diversity stuff is central to our mission and our success as an organization, and we need to do that, then they need to invest the resources in terms of making that happen. It's not enough to sort of try to quietly extract extra labor from people you think can do it, right? Because it's like, for me, it's like, you know what I know how to do? Sociology studies. And I know how to teach sociology, right? But that's what I know how to do. Like, I don't know how to, you know, fix the, you know, pay algorithm for Georgetown University. So it'd be crazy to have me on a committee to do that, right? I mean, that's just a hypothetical. I know everything. No, I don't. But yeah, but it's, so I think, you know, so in some ways, right, yeah, to that question, it's a good question. And I guess my inclination is like, I don't think it's, you know, it shouldn't fall disproportionately on the marginalized workers to fix the problems of marginalization, partly because, one, it's not their job. Two, they're marginalized. So how much power do they actually have to change anything? And the whole thing is only going to work if there's like a gatekeeper who's like, okay, I'm down. And it's like, well, maybe what you should do is hire gatekeepers, decision makers who are either from this marginalized groups or are like down to increase, you know, inclusion, and then that'll fix your problem.
Right. So would it be fair to say that you would say there should be people hired to do this, like this kind of work to, you know, improve organizations, those people whose job it is to do it, and or if people are asked to do this kind of on the side or in addition to their regular work, they would be paid for it? Is that kind of?
I mean, generally when I do work for pay, I like to get paid. When I do paid work, I like to get paid for it. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I don't, you know, it's, look, I think, I don't, and the thing, we're talking very much about work context, right? So if I think about, you know, what's happening in my church, I'm not gonna be like, oh, sorry, pastor, but you're gonna have to pay me if you want this insight. You know, it's like, well, right, it's a volunteer organization. So I'm willing to like volunteer to be a part of it and like help or whatever. But, so right, I think there is something about this conversation happening in the context of work versus other kind of organizations, maybe non-work, sort of volunteer organizations, or you know, your kid's school or something like that, where the dynamics would probably play out differently. But yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like if you're asking employees to do work, you should compensate them for it.
Agreed. We have a bunch of questions that I haven't been able to catch up with.
Yeah, right. So many good questions. Okay, let's see.
Yes.
Someone asked, what are some of the other major places, system practices that naturally reproduce unfairness and white supremacy in organizational life? I mean, I think, I'm not sure that there's like an actual set answer to that. One thing I would say is it might be worth questioning. I mean, we're sociologists, so of course we're gonna like hairs raised up on the back of the neck at the idea of things being naturally reproduced, right? It's like, well, I don't know if any of this is like naturally happening, but I think the bigger question that's raised here, and it's a good one, is more one of like, it's worth interrogating within any organization what's going on here in regards to issues around diversity, inclusion, power, right? And so to not just sort of let them sit unexplored, right? So I'm not sure there actually is an obvious answer. I mean, obviously, I think I would want to look around issues of recruitment and retainment, compensation, authority, right? It's sort of being like, well, these are probably spaces where, that are critical junctures for, in terms of like, organizational outcomes around who gets what and who gets how much and how is that distributed. But I think it's an excellent question, but I think the bigger component of it to me is like, I think it's something that's worth interrogating within organizations, right?
Agreed. I like this question that just came in. What is your take on non-people of color leading diversity and inclusion trainings? So my initial sort of response is, I think that is fine if it's good. If it's good.
Right, yeah, it's like if they know what they're doing, then do it, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, it's like, I don't know, people, it might be more powerful, right? In terms of like, they might be able to speak to audiences in a way that, maybe I couldn't or Becky couldn't. I'm pointing like this it feels so much like a conversation. I'm pointing like you're right next to me. And so, right, it's probably worth considering, what is the face of the message around things like diversity and inclusion trainings, right? And we also know through sociological research, right, that everyone doesn't get listened to the same way by the same people. So it might actually be, right. Obviously there's this tension of like, well, can you embrace racist practices in an effort to undermine them if it's like, oh, well, white people won't listen to Black Corey, so we need to get a white Corey in here to make them not be racist. But again, I think, this sort of circles back to a broader thing around that point that I think I've been making, is that I'm not convinced the goal is to actually change people, like people's beliefs or people's attitudes or people's deep feelings. I think we should think about the goals as creating environments where everyone is treated fairly, equally compensated as such, and has an equal opportunity to get success and authority and power within an organization. And I can speak to my own experiences of being in organizations. Sometimes in the organizations where that's been the most possible, haven't always been the organizations where I felt like everybody in them is super not racist and cool and not sexist and not anti-gay. It's like, no, they've been the places where it's like, this is an outcome we want, and our institution, the rules are structured around that, and the norms are at a minimum grounded in enacting that as a performance. You don't have to believe it, but you need to act like it. And it's not so much of like, oh, what we have to do is, change the spirits of people. It's like, that's admirable work, but maybe more difficult work. But what you can do is change how your department goes about recruiting people for jobs, right? Like you're probably gonna have a hard time, convincing everyone in your department to not be a sexist jerk. But what you can do is say, every time we post a job ad, we also have to post that ad in, on this platform, on this platform, on this platform. And, the committee has to be made up of, a range of people in terms of like what their interests are and who they would want to see in the job, right? Like these are things that are within sort of the purview of organizations, which I think circles back to what we were talking about at the beginning, right? Thinking about the sort of level of analysis that you're at and what you can do, right? At like an individual micro level, I can probably have a conversation with someone and they would walk away from it and be like, you know what, maybe I need to rethink what I thought about Black folks. Because like, wow, that really changed something in me because I got to meet somebody and maybe I'll be different, maybe I won't. But I'm not sure you can turn around an organization on that principle with that sort of strategy and just be like, you know what we're gonna do? Make sure every racist in here has a positive interaction with Becky or Corey. And it's like, well, what? You know, like, one, I have a job I need to do. Like, my job can't be converting all your in-house racists. And two, it just seems like, I'm not sure that's the organization's job, right?
There's an interesting question that I missed before, but someone was asking, and I guess this is the last question maybe, that we have time for. In order to change racism in organizations, don't we have to start with addressing racism in schools? How can we combat racism within educational systems? And actually a related question, somebody who's 15 said,
Yeah.
I know, I'm 15 and I'm wondering what the best way is for a minor to help demolish institutionalized racism, such as within my high school. You know, I think these questions make a really good point. Education may be a really important sort of spot for these kinds of things to be done. Because they're training people, you know, they're training young people to go out into the workforce and do things. I mean, I think once they're out in the workforce, I think the organizations themselves like have to, you know, it's the structures that matter. So even if the, you know, students are themselves not racist and they're, you know, I don't know, that doesn't mean that they can't graduate and then go out into these organizations that are structured badly, and then it's not that helpful. So really,
I also think, yeah. And I also think it's important to remember that schools themselves are organizations, right? Like, so everything that we've been saying and talking about in the context of workplaces also would apply to school. Like, those are organizations as well, right? And so the way that they're structured and the way that they're run and the rules that are there are doing a lot of very similar kinds of work in terms of like, are they working to produce racial justice or are they working to reproduce racial inequality? And so I guess I would say, you know, in terms of it being 15 and thinking about what you can do in your school, right? I would say, you know, look at school policies, right? Like, think about what are the school policies here, and like, what are those policies? Are those policies working in ways that, you know, operate fairly and treat everyone the same and give everyone like access to, you know, the same opportunities and let everyone, you know, have opportunities to, you know, be their best, if you will. I mean, super vaguely, right? But I would say, yeah, so if I was in high school, I would be looking to those kinds of things, right? And sort of asking those kinds of questions.
And just because you're a student doesn't mean you can't ask whether the teachers are getting paid fairly, whether, you know, whether the power structure, like who's in charge, who answers to whom.
Right, who decides how people get into like honors classes and like, you know, like, I would say interrogate those kinds of questions. Right. Oh my God, there's so many good questions here, but we've talked so long on stuff. It's gone by so fast. So yeah, I think we should probably get Rosemary back here. Let's see. How can one be an ally without being annoyed and burdensome? I mean, right, good question. Yeah, that's hard. I don't really, I mean, yeah. I mean, I know, don't ask me to help you process stuff all the time. Don't include me on emails and stuff. And listen, I think, you know, just like I mean, at super individual level, I just feel like it is a little bit like be a human, like be a person, like be a friend, yeah, be friends with people, not just be my friend, not just my ally. And if you're my friend, it'll give you cues on how to be a good ally. But that's ridiculously hopeful. All right, Rosemary.
Thank you very much. That was a great question. That last question about how to become an ally, with placing the burden on the person who is minority or the person who's a woman or what have you. I think
Right.
to begin by educating themselves, recognizing where they have their gaps of knowledge and what they can do to help themselves rather than expect for the Black person or for the woman or for the Latina or for the Asian woman to educate you. Take that responsibility and do it yourself. I want to thank Dr. Hsu and Dr. Fields for doing your man's work today. This was a phenomenal discussion, and the time literally flew by. I think you had some wonderful points that you made, and I wish we had another half an hour at least to continue the dialogue. But based upon the wonderful feedback that we've gotten, in fact, I received several emails already during this conversation from people who've heard and participated in the discussion. So I think we may have to do an encore at some point. But let us just thank you both very warmly and expect that you will be participating in more dialogue as we go forward.
Thank you.
You're certainly welcome. Next week, we're gonna have Professor Lynn Ross from the McCord School, who will be moderating a panel discussion on Black women, voters, candidates, and office holders. And again, this is very timely in light of the elections, and we've got to get rid of, I don't want to sound too partisan here, but we need to make some significant changes. When we talked about leadership and the importance of leadership and the stance that we want them to take in making sure that they're operating in the interests of the majority of our people who have been downtrodden, if you will. So please tune in to our conversation next week. We have Jamil Scott, who is a professor in government, and we have Dr. Michelle Swears, who is also a professor in that department. And they've done tons of research on this topic, and I hope that you will come back and join us again for that. So that's
going to be so good.
That's
so
an
good.
excellent thing. Yes, I promise you that. Thank you very much for listening in today. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.